Good morning, everyone. Um, it's at the top here. We're going to just do intros and then I'll get into housekeeping. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Tiana Lyons King, and I am CAM's Community Engagement Manager. As we begin today's event, we'd like to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. California is home to over 150 tribes, and an acknowledgement is just one step towards working with Native communities to build meaningful relationships. Museums and many institutions were founded upon purposeful exclusions and erasures of Indigenous people and still benefit greatly from settler colonialism and associated harms. CAM is committed to moving beyond land acknowledgement and into action. We encourage you to learn more about the tribes in your area and find ways to celebrate and support them. I am on the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay people. I'd recommend using or checking out, I should say, nativeland.ca. It's a helpful but not definitive resource for you all. I'll pop that in the chat for you. And we'll move now into some housekeeping for today's workshop series. Just so everyone's aware, this workshop series our session is being recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel once it is edited. You all will receive a link via email once it is uploaded. For those who have not been to our workshops before, just so you're aware, these workshops are a space for learning and collaboration. We ask that you are respectful to yourself and also to others in the room. The chat box will be open throughout the session. You are welcome to ask questions in that chat box. The questions will be answered after the main portion of our session with Jessica today. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you're welcome to send me a message in the chat box directly, and I will be happy to answer or ask the question on your behalf. If you have any technical issues, you can chat me in the chat box, or you can email me at engagement@calmuseums.org. I'll post my email in the chat for you all as well. And with that, we will get started on today's session, Healthy Boundaries with Jessica Denise Dixon. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here. Forgive my morning voice. When Tiana and I got on the call, I realized I had not spoken to another soul this morning until we got on. So you're still getting my scruffy voice, but I'm excited to be here with you today. And I'm really just excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, and a topic that I think is just so important, which is boundaries. This is our third of 4 workshops, and I think it is setting us up well for the next one, which is really on like making a commitment and staying accountable. So boundaries have really recently jumped into the cultural consciousness, and I'm really excited that they have, but they are also misused and misunderstood. I like this Prentice Hemphill quote: boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. Now, when we're at work, you might be like, love is a bit of a leap. So maybe you replace the word love with care or honor, but ultimately, boundaries are the limits that we set for ourselves that determines what acceptable ways of relating to one another are. We create boundaries, we create limits that help us remain in right relationship with people and helps us understand, what we really need for health, safety, and flourishing. They're like a dividing line that says this works and this doesn't work. Boundaries help us say, like, I'm a whole, autonomous, sovereign human, and I am different from you. And this is how we get to be in healthy relationship with one another. Sometimes people don't like boundaries because they think freedom is just the right to do anything they want without any real consequence. And what I would say that doing anything without consequence is actually less about freedom and more about privilege. The more privilege and power, especially when wealth privilege is involved, there's often less accountability. When you even think about anything that there's a fee for, who does that really impact? people who have millions of dollars or people who don't really have much. Um, and what does accountability look like there, right? But talk about that next week. The more free we are, the more boundaries we have, because it's the limits that we choose in life that help support and cultivate our freedom. Taking reckless action isn't true freedom, nor is like being cruel to others out of some sort of ideal of radical honesty. A few years ago, there was this like, well, I'm just being like radically honest, and people were just saying whatever was on their mind. It's like, well, that's not really helpful, right? And the absence of fear, this idea of fearlessness or invincibility, also isn't the same as being safe. So freedom and our sense of safety really go hand in hand. The boundaries that we set allow us to have a fuller expression of freedom. Now, I don't personally have kids, but I love kids. But I think about the wisdom that comes from the times when we are innocent and we're just exploring the world, right? So you don't keep poison where kids can get to it. You keep it behind a cabinet that's out of their reach or that might be locked. The cabinet is a kind of boundary that allows that child to explore the world from a place of real freedom, right? The child can explore all the things. They can pull out the pots and pans. They can bang on them like they are a drummer in a rock band. They can pull books off the shelves. They can pull clothes out of drawers, but they cannot get to poison. So that boundary allows them to be free to explore and to be, while also not potentially harming themselves. One of my personal boundaries is no non-consensual advice giving, meaning if I have a problem or I'm going through something and I'm talking to you about it, that does not mean I'm talking to you about it because I want or need you to solve it. So then the question becomes like, what would make something more consensual? One would be context, right? Say we're in a meeting discussing a project and we're really talking about how something can be improved. The context of the meeting implies consent. So I might have feelings about the kind of feedback that I'm getting, or that I'm getting feedback, or that it wasn't perfect because maybe I'm a perfectionist. But it's still in a place where it is very welcome and solicited. Another way is, right, the person that I'm speaking to, they say, hey, I have something to offer you if you're cool with it. And then I'm like, yeah, cool. Or I'm like, actually, right now, no thanks. And my personal boundary came from the fact that when someone just like gives me advice about something I didn't ask them about, my experience of myself changes. It drives me into feeling like I did something wrong or bad, or like someone is trying to fix me and they feel like I'm broken in some way. And I don't like feeling like that. And so it might not actually have been their intention to try to fix me, but my experience of myself and them is that. So the way that people can honor, our relationship is by practicing consensual advice giving and feedback giving. That's how we stay in healthy relationship, where I'm not projecting onto them their intention, and I don't have to feel like I'm a kid again being punished for something. So there are a few things that we want to really be mindful about when we are talking about boundaries. The first thing is that they are new, because they're new to cultural consciousness. Like there's a lot of things we have to adjust to within culture. People who sometimes are older might have judgments around the younger generation or why they're needed. I ran into this with my mom. When I started to really have the boundary of, please don't give me advice unless I ask for it, my mom had to work through her own cultural context. Was that she wasn't really allowed to have boundaries even as an adult child, but definitely not as a young child. She was the oldest of five with four younger brothers. She was kind of, she really was the nurturing mom because my grandmother was a little bit harsh, and it wasn't a thing. Like, so for her, it was like, why do you need this? It feels silly, it feels unnecessary. But the more that we practiced, and I had to, hey, mom, remember we have a boundary around this. I would just love for you to ask me next time before you give me advice. Hey, it took her a while. But she started to actually practice not giving advice without consent in her other relationships. And years later, she calls me and she's like, I have been practicing not giving advice. And she found herself less emotionally taxed, and she found herself actually enjoying conversations with people where before she felt like she needed for some reason to give advice to them. And so I loved that she got to have that experience for herself. But boundary setting, boundary upholding, and boundary honoring are all practices that we all can do, but it might take a while because it's new in our culture. The second thing is often we have an internal boundary long before we verbalize it externally, or before we feel like we can verbalize it externally. So sometimes we have an internal boundary, or we end up setting kind of reactive boundaries. Now, it's important for us to know that it's not someone else's responsibility to know that I prefer something, that I desire something, I need something without me telling them. Now, I wish mind reading was a thing, but even people who are really attuned cannot read minds. So we can often get upset when someone violates an internal boundary that we haven't communicated, and we can feel resentment, we can, withdraw, we can fight maybe, but we really have to practice our communication around this and develop more skill around our communication. Another thing that goes along with this is often that when a person or action has violated our boundaries, we usually feel it in our bodies, right? We might straighten up, we might go rigid, we might recoil, but we live in a society that has really disembodied us. Capitalism has disembodied us. It has conditioned us to be disconnected from those bodily reactions. So we stuff them down, we play cool, we act like nothing is wrong, especially for people who are socialized female. And when that happens, we can end up losing touch with what's important to us, with what honors us, or we can even end up just kind of blowing up on people. So it really takes slowing down and being in our bodies, because our bodies hold truth. Um, and so that's an important thing. The third thing I want to talk about is power. Power is always going to play a role in conversations that center equity. It's no different with boundaries. So as you're listening, maybe you are someone who doesn't have a lot of positional power and you wonder how setting a boundary is going to go over with your boss. Or you might be the boss and it feels easy for you to set a boundary because you have the power to, but you've never considered that other people might have boundaries that they're not setting because you're the boss and the ways that you show up. So centering equity will always be a process of dismantling toxic power over dynamics. So as we talk about boundaries, right, if you hold a position of power or an identity of privilege, you want to ask yourself, am I setting this to create more power distance and create more of a gap between those who are lower on a hierarchical level than me? Or am I creating boundaries that are actually about the flourishing of the employees and the organization? For those of you who don't have positional power, you still get to have boundaries. They're not only for people with power. And if you're in an organization that doesn't support that, that might be something for you to consider. Or it might take some time. It might be something for you to introduce. You might send this to your supervisor and be like, "Hey, this I want to talk to you about this." And the fourth thing I want to talk about is that we can set boundaries because we need them for our mental health, or because we're being taxed, or because of our capacity. And that's really, really important. It's also really important to start looking at what boundaries can we create for flourishing. The base level is safety and health, wholeness. Within this organization, within my life, what boundaries do we need to create safety and health? But when we look at liberation, and anti-racism is a practice of liberation. The liberatory perspective is beyond surviving into thriving and flourishing. And this might mean institutionalizing certain things like no email after hours, right? So like even if you work after hours, you have to schedule it for the next morning. It might be also like, exploring why people are working after hours. Like, why is work not set up for people to complete what they need to during the workday? I hear from salary people who are like, yeah, I had to wrap something up when I was home Saturday night. And I was like, what? Just because you're not hourly does not mean your work should not fit into the hours of the workday. So maybe things need to be taken off the calendar, or deadlines need to be pushed, or the whole idea of like, why is this, our how capitalistic are our goals and our ideals? Are they pushing us past what is natural for us and what we can really handle within our workday? And it might mean that more compensation is required for certain tasks. You know, some boundaries that can lead to flourishing can be made into rules and expectations within the organization. So, as always, I have some reflection questions that I'm just going to put in the chat throughout our time. We're not necessarily going to have time to go over them until the end. So, if you want to start reviewing them, if you want to save them, go ahead. So, I'm going to move on to what I think is a really, really important conversation, but it's often either undervalued or not necessarily considered when talking about boundaries. And I want you to consider these within the context of your organization, because you're probably going to, and your life, but yeah. And that is space and time. So, territoriality. It's a really important concept because every person in this world has a sense of space, like how I sense space in a sense of what is their own space versus what is another's. And that is socially constructed, meaning we learn from a young age what's our space and how much space we should or are allowed to take up. And when we start a new job, when we're led to our cubicle or our office, we learn how to take up space. Now, most of us don't consciously think about space, but often we do have messages, either explicit or implicit, about how we take up space. People who are socialized female are often told or learn from observing things like close your legs, cross your legs, cross your arms, make yourself small, keep your hands at your side, don't take up too much space. And when we do take up too much space, we're too big for our britches, or we're called the B word, or we're like masculinized, like she's just one of the dudes, right? Whereas man spreading, you all know what that is, right? It became a phrase because of how prevalent it is, this splay behavior with legs. The socialization within men often, especially who have power, positional power, is to take up space, but not only that, right? To like own the space that they're in. So it's like, why should they be small? I was recently at an event and I was sitting next to this man, and I'm fat for those of you who don't know. So, baby, my whole body is taking up this seat, right? My whole body is here. And this man who's much smaller than me, he had his legs open. And I was like, okay. I just wanted to sit and be comfortable within the boundaries of my own chair, but his leg just kept pushing into mine. And I'm like, what are you doing? So, what's important about that is within the nervous system, leg spreading, leg splay behavior, that's a display of dominance. And so, men learn to expand, while many women learn to make themselves small. And that's going to impact how people show up and boundaries, how to create them, what boundaries might be needed. Another thing about territoriality is closeness, and this is proximity, right? So we have a distance where we know someone is too close to us, and we can really consider that line our personal space, even if we never articulate it. For some, it's bigger, for others, it's smaller. Some of us fight to hold space, like, I don't care how close you get up, this is my space. Others of us flee, we walk away, we shrink our bodies, we try to make ourselves small. If we have a strong appease response, we might just stay there really, really uncomfortably. In some cultures and public spaces, there is no sense of personal space. Like if you're in public, your sense of space ends at your body and that's it. So I can come an inch from you and that just is what it is. But here, the kind of standard for non-personal or business chats is about 5.5 to 8 feet. Now, a foot or less, that's our whisper zone. That's nobody else is supposed to hear that. That's very personal. That's very private. And then, of course, when we're speaking to a large group, the distance can be between 20 and 30 feet before the distance becomes so big that it feels like the person is disconnected from us. When we go to places like church, when we go to conferences where there's a keynote speaker, that distance is supposed to be, it's like intentionally used to create them as expert or person who is higher in some way. And that's really kind of intentional because that's what it creates within our systems. And of course, the pandemic has reshaped this for some of us. When we had to be 6 feet away from one another, that was our automatic personal distance zone. So before it was like, you know, close up to about 5 feet. Now we're automatically, what was public has become personal. And so for some of us, that still is true. I'm still very uncomfortable when I'm at the grocery store and people aren't giving me space. Like when people are just like right behind me in the grocery store, I'm like, 6 feet. But many people have gone back to pre-pandemic norms. Many of us are on Zoom a lot, so some of you might be remote most of the time or part of the time. And when someone is far from the camera, we can really feel disconnected from them. It can feel really weird when someone is too far back because this is kind of the context for how far we are from our Zoom. So even that shapes us. Now, our sense of personal space can be an unconscious boundary because sometimes we're uncomfortable and we don't know why. And it's often because there was a violation of our sense of space, but we are taught to really kind of ignore those, um, especially if someone isn't doing something outright harmful, right? And I will say sometimes, like if someone appears homeless, then there's often a shift to stay at a public distance or farther. So there's like a way that we're conditioned to like move away, right? Or if we're socialized to be afraid of a specific kind of person, like if you're taught that like Black men are something to be feared, there's going to be more of a natural move to make sure that that public distance is kept. And so we're much more likely to address those kind of space violations. Um, so the ways we're oriented in space and whether we're honoring our own personal boundaries is going to make a difference in how we move in the world and how we relate to one another. If there is a sense of crowding, like there are too many people here, way too close, you might have a flee response, like you might want to run, you might want to disconnect. You might have a fight response. You might respond with a lot of defensiveness. You might not even know why it is like that. It's the same when we get really hot somewhere. We end up like we either need to go so we can cool down or we start to fight. We get irritated, we get irritable. Things get more annoying much faster. So there's a reality too where the cultural conditioning around space might be different from what you actually need or feel the safest and most comfortable with. Um, so even if you're like remote, right, territoriality is still shaping space boundaries. But I want us to think about office space for a second, right? Are people in cubicles? If so, are they shared cubicles? Like when I go in the 3 days of the week, I have the cubicle and then someone else for 2 days shares it. Does everyone have their own? Do people have their own offices? How are those situated? Who gets window space? Personalizing space is a form of boundary setting. It's a way of saying, this is mine and it's not yours, but it's also a way of showing other people, this is who I am. So often the more personalized a space there is, the more oh, that's not a space, that's mine. I tend to not decorate my home. I'm getting more pictures up, but it's like I don't have a very personalized home, which is I don't know. I have a big personality, so it's fine. But those who work from home, I remember talking to many people who, when a lot of people went remote, they were so happy to be home because they didn't have to face kind of the normal microaggressions and things like that. But they also weren't necessarily interested in people seeing their home because it was personal. And thankfully, Zoom, continues to and developed backgrounds and blur features, but it was like a real concern. Like you can see some of me, but not like too much of me. Like I don't want you in my home. I'm happy to work from home, but I don't need you here with me. So even now there's a lot of conversation about open workspaces. And for the most part, a lot of places that went to open workspaces have transitioned back. Why? Because people need space. There wasn't consideration around space boundaries and how those shape how we interact with each other and how we work, right? We need space to like zone out to make calls, to scroll TikTok for just a minute, to feel like we're not under constant surveillance. Now I'm working on something, but I have to worry about like, is someone watching what I'm doing now? Because we're all in this open space. So having defined space can be a really, really healthy boundary for an organization. So I'm gonna copy these questions and put them in the chat before I move on to the next thing, which is time. So, and time is really bound up with space. And just the way that space is shaped by culture, time is as well. And our sense of time has been shaped by capitalism as we know it and the Industrial Revolution. That's when our sense of time really became what it is now. And we are in what's called a monochronic, low context time culture. These cultures focus on one thing at a time without interruptions. Deadlines are very serious. Time is related to as linear and always moving forward. Time is scheduled and compartmentalized. Time is thought of as something tangible, something that can be wasted, spent, saved, lost. Here, there's a focus on promptness and privacy. Interruptions can be detrimental to the plan and throw everything off. If you can't keep up with the times, you'll be left behind. And then time needs trump often the needs of the people. And this is different from polychronic, high context cultures where many things are done at once. Interruptions are welcome because relationships are prioritized over tasks. You know, the task will get done when the right people are in the room, and that's what matters. Plans and deadlines are changed with relative ease, and then time actually serves the people rather than the people being at the will of time. So, what does your organization tend toward? A lot of our organizations are set up to be this low context, monochronic um, culture. These time cultures will create unconscious boundaries about how we relate to time. So, I want to talk about some things that are important when we talk about time. One thing is time pressure. This is the perception that there's time scarcity to complete a task relative to the demands of it. It's the sense that there's not enough time, so we have to rush, or we have to work late, or we have to come in early. Time pressures are important. Another is time strain. It's what we experience if something has a lot of time pressure, but we feel totally out of control of it. Time's going by, we don't feel like we can do anything, right? We need to be moving faster or with more urgency than we're actually able to. So if we do need to move faster, but we can't, time can feel like it is dragging. Like, why is time moving so slow? Things that contribute to time pressure and time strains are called time crunch items. Some of these you might know. Some time crunch items are feeling like you're perpetually available and you have no time to yourself. You know, cell phones have kind of made us constantly available in a lot of ways. Feeling like there's just not enough time in general. Cutting back on sleep to do more. Feeling like you're trapped in a routine or stuck in a rut. Wanting more time to yourself in general. Wanting more downtime, like time with no agenda or a focused goal. Feeling like you have too many things to do in a row or in a certain amount of time or in response to something. If your organization has a ton of time crunch items, people might naturally overstep their boundaries to complete tasks or to work late, right? And this might be something where institutionalized boundaries get put in place. As if people are feeling like they have too much to do and not enough time, that's going to impact a lot of things. Another time related thing is wait time, which can be a way that people wield power within the organization. So people higher up on the hierarchy can make other people, lower people, wait as long as is needed. And making people wait can be a display of dominance and importance. But people who are lower on the hierarchy, when they do it, it's seen as disrespectful. Kids don't make parents wait. Supervisees don't make their boss wait, right? So another thing about wait time is that the longer we wait, the more deserving we feel of something. So if the boss makes me wait 2 hours to see him because his other meetings have run over, I feel entitled to his time. So if he comes in and blows me off, it's going to then feel like a violation. Like I'm owed this time because you made me wait. Um, Another aspect of time that's important is lead time. Not having enough lead time or advance warning about something can make someone feel unprepared or even idiotic. But who gets lead time is also often a matter of power. People in power may not give their subordinates enough time because lead time is always for the person who is higher, right? If you don't give your supervisor enough lead time, you are then seen as not trustworthy. You are then seen as unreliable. But the boss can tell you, we got to do this in 2 days, and you have to shift your whole world around. Your whole life gets upended by this, right? Another aspect is culture reaction time. And this is the time required for a response to a threat, injustice, a slight, challenge. The longer it takes to respond within white culture, the less likely a response is to happen. So there's less need within white culture to focus on it, right? So, and white culture often believes this to be true of others. Other cultures can wait a long time, though. There's more long suffering, there's more patience. Other cultures can even expect some things to take longer to resolve because they know that it takes time to mature. So, Black people still talk about reparations. Indigenous folks still talk about land back. People say slavery was how long ago? Yeah, because our culture reaction time is longer. We have the capacity. We have, you know, we want this to be resolved, and it's not just um over because time passes. We are in a time heals culture that says like, oh, enough time has passed. We should just move on from something, and that's really not how humanity works, unfortunately. So time heals cultures are just they're kind of this false thing that people can cling to. But these aspects of time and space, they're going to impact our natural boundaries. And as you're doing work to reshape culture and creating healthy liberatory boundaries, they are really, really important things to remember. So I have a few reflections for you. Give me 2 seconds. All right, friends. I know these are a lot, so don't worry. Don't worry about them all right now. They're just for you to, these questions are for you to think about later, right? So we can't talk about territoriality and time or boundaries without talking about the nervous system. Just like we can't talk about anything without talking about power. Power and the nervous system are always going to be things that we talk about, right? Because these things pattern our nervous system. So I've talked about the flee response and the fight response a few times today, but I want to just go back to the basics. Our nervous systems are the complex connection of nerves that carry messages from our brain to other parts of our body and from other parts of our body to our brain. So it's concerned with our survival and helps control various parts of our existence, both voluntary and involuntary, that we often don't really consciously think about. So its goal is to maintain the status quo and to keep us safe. And keeping us safe often means like maintaining the status quo. So even if something's really not the best, not freeing, not liberatory, it can feel new and different and scary to our nervous system. They are great because anything that looks like danger, they help us react to it. But our nervous systems don't have time context or situational context, meaning that they don't know that right now is different from 3 years ago, that is actually not the exact same situation, that we don't have to be worried right now because our nervous system is like the more primitive part of our brain that is just concerned with survival. So then we get to give context to our nervous system. And one of the ways that we can do that is through boundary setting. If boundaries are about our health, safety, and flourishing, we have to have a relationship with our nervous system. And we have to know the difference between when between when something is making us feel uncomfortable or just unsafe. Many people have been socialized into whiteness and have internalized comfort focus and conflict aversion, which are two characteristics of white supremacy. And they've conflated those things with safety. So if we avoid conflict and we're comfortable, we're safe, which means if we're uncomfortable, that we're unsafe, and conflict might somehow lead to our death. And I'm not talking about our mental, I'm talking about our nervous systems are conditioned in this way. So to set healthy boundaries from a regulated place, we have to know the difference between those things. If we're conflict averse because it feels like conflict is putting us an inch from death, we're not going to be able to set healthy boundaries and we won't be able to uphold them. So we get to ask ourselves, is there a threat or am I just uncomfortable? What is the thing that feels like a threat? Can I name it? And what is there a potential threat to? And what is the impact of that threat? We want to set boundaries from a regulated place. We really do. We may set them because we know we have certain sensitivities or triggers, but we also want to be regulated because when we're dysregulated trying to set a boundary, we don't actually always get to the thing that we really need. We can really get lost swimming around the trigger rather than understanding what would help us avoid the trigger. And what would center our sense of safety. And I'm not just talking about as individuals, there are also like collective wounds of an organization, of a place as well, that need to be considered. So if I were to set like a boundary from a dysregulated place too, it'd be really easy for me to create a story that the person who is hurting me or violating my boundary in some way is uncaring or bossy, or that they need to be punished. But when I really get down to, what the actual trigger is and the impact of it on me, then I can focus on what's really important, which is what I need and what we need. So, a brief overview of the nervous system reactivity. We have a few responses. We have the fight, flight, freeze, appease, and collapse. Now, the first is freeze. And we go here first evolutionarily because the easiest likelihood of us not being attacked was based on our ability to be still and remain unseen as a predator is like scanning. There's a pause here. You see this in babies when there's a startle response. They get startled and they pause and then they cry. It can be a very small amount of time, a few split seconds. But if you're traumatized, you can also get stuck in freeze. Many of us actually have to work to bring up our fight response or our flight response, depending on the situation. Um, Freeze is like deer in headlights. So what's happening is the body's preparing for what needs to happen next. So it can stay in freeze, it could go into fight, flight, appease, or collapse. The freeze response gives us time to assess. Usually our assessment's really fast and based on the most effective thing to keep us safe and alive. Um, so the next is flight, because again, fighting evolutionarily, the last resort, hopefully, we only fight when we need to, and we hope to not need to. So we flee, we run, we distance, we block, we evade, we do what we can to create distance. Our fight response is as it seems. As it seems. Evolutionarily, the body converts fear into aggression so that, we could find rage so that we could fight for our lives. But these days, it shows up a lot in verbal arguments. We don't physically fight as much. So it shows up in insults, in ad hominem phrases, counter allegations, denigration of professional status, goading, sarcasm, things like that. And it shows up in our body language of dominance. Next, we have appease and collapse, and they are part of the parasympathetic response where the body shuts down a bit. This and collapse tend to happen the more powerless you feel. Appease is called fawning or people pleasing or submitting, and it includes things like saying yes when you want to say no, flattering people, or even agreeing with something that you don't really agree with. It's like going along to get along. It's a way of deferring your own sense of self so you won't be seen as a challenge or a threat and create more problems. So you're doing what you can do to reduce immediate threat and minimize violence. Often people who use this the most, they feel ashamed because they're like, I didn't want to do this. I should have done something else. But it literally meant that your nervous system thought that this was the way that you could survive. Now, appease can be a common response for people whose identities are marginalized, or when there's hierarchy and you don't hold the power. It can be a passive, like resignation trauma response that comes from knowing that it's not safe for you because you don't have the power. So you have to minimize yourself to survive the environment. Often when Black people or when people condemn Black people, Black men killed by the police for not complying, they're really saying like, you didn't appease, you didn't fawn, well enough. You should have just done that, which I hate because it's not true. The collapse response is a way that the body just kind of shuts down, the muscles relax, the heart rate decreases. The person might not even be able to speak. They might actually faint or pass out. They may let go of their bowels. Their body might tremble or be weak. This is also called a flop response. And it's when we have a response like this, it's really time to check in with ourselves around what's happening in our world and what we need. We want our nervous system to respond appropriately to true threats. And if something is landing as a threat all the time, it might be actually helpful to set a boundary around it. If we have a culture where people are in fight a lot or they're in flee a lot, we might actually just need more boundaries. And we want to set boundaries without weaponizing our traumas. We don't want to wield our traumas and like beat them on other people with them. No, we want to say like this is what is going to lead to flourishing and health. So let's go there, because there's our own personal nervous system, but there's also a nervous system within the organization or within a system. So unless like you're new, right? You when you're new, you don't like know who not to make mad or what to not ask or those kinds of things. But when you're within the system, you know what's safe, what's considered bad, what's considered a threat. You know what to do and what not to do. And those things are part of the organization's collective nervous system. So we're bringing our own past traumas, past concerns to work, but there's also what is happening within that system of work, within the organization, that's patterning how people are showing up. So a few more questions for you before we go on, and they're in the chat. So boundaries, they are individual as well as collective, right? What do I need to thrive? What do we need to thrive? So setting boundaries is made up of a few things. Um, I say they're made up of your why, your request, and the outcome of a violation. So your why, what do you value? How do you feel? And what's the impact when it's not held? Your request is the what, and the outcome is then if you do violate, what is my response? What do I do? Because it's not a punishment that says like you get to be punished. It's like, no, I do something or don't do something because of it. So the why, boundaries are important because they're not simply a not that. They're not just, I don't want that, right? It's not just that I have reactivity around unsolicited advice, so don't give me that. It's also, I value my agency and autonomy and my ability to actually like sort through things. And I would like others to honor that as well. It's that when people give me unsolicited feedback, it triggers shame and unworthiness and incompetence in me. And I don't really want to have that experience of myself or other people. It's also like, I don't like unsolicited advice. So, what would make me feel more spacious? What would make me feel honored, cared for, and more abundant within this situation? So, our why is really, really important. What would lead to thriving, flourishing, and what's the impact without those boundaries? The what is then making the request. You don't always have to show up and say, I just have a boundary that you can. I say it all the time because I'm with people who have a context of what boundaries are and are also doing their work. You can make a request. I request that you don't. I can only do. I'm not at a place to discuss. Blank isn't funny. Please refrain from telling jokes like that around me. I don't have the capacity for. I'm not comfortable with. I won't tolerate. There are a lot of ways to say things without saying like this is my boundary, and you can say that as well. But if you're on people who are like what's that, you just be a regular person, right? Just be a regular person. um and then of course there is the upholding. How do you uphold boundaries? Now, this is an important skill because human beings are just human beings. We're going to push the limits on things to find like what's real. So I've had people push back on my boundaries because they didn't think I was going to uphold them. Yeah, that happens sometimes. Sometimes it does. Um, And sometimes we're just woefully unskilled in honoring a boundary until we build skill around it. There is the sentiment that people who violate boundaries don't care. And I have had that. I've had that experience. But I also think that's an oversimplification. People who violate boundaries sometimes don't have an understanding of what they are. Sometimes it's because they want to control you or manipulate you, but sometimes they just don't know how to behave differently. Some like just the they're doing something totally different. Sometimes they don't know how to do that because they have to show up differently to honor your boundary and they might not know how. It can be really dysregulating when someone sets a boundary because it means our world is changing in some way. Some boundaries are easier to honor than others. Some boundaries are bigger, especially if it's about access, if it's about access to someone or access to speaking a certain way or whatever, it can be hard. So we don't have to hold space for their dysregulation, but it doesn't help to craft a narrative around it that people don't care. People aren't bad or they don't hate you necessarily just because they're unable to uphold the boundary immediately. They may not know how. So I want you to consider too, like what skill does it take to uphold these boundaries? Because you're going to set them. You're going to, people are going to have whatever response they want, but, depending on your relationship, to be able to ask like what is actually needed to uphold this boundary? Like how do we do it? How do we live it? That's the thing. And then that's a skill that needs to be practiced. The behaviors need to be practiced. um when I was setting boundaries around unsolicited advice and non-consensual advice, like I had to say, here's what I would like you to do instead. Here are some options for you. Because they didn't know. My mom didn't know. Other people are like, what? But when I offered that, now they have some things to go to that are in their toolbox. Now, I'm not saying you have to do the work for people, but boundaries are about how we can remain in relationship with one another. So when we're talking about upholding them, the question is like, what happens when someone doesn't uphold? And it's really just dysregulating when someone sets a boundary, but also when someone violates a boundary. Like I get like fire breathing dragon, like leave me alone. So it's important to choose a practice of presence and to get regulated. You might stop a conversation, you might remove yourself, you might step away, you might say something like, hey, blank was our boundary, and you aren't honoring it when you continue to blank. And if this continues, I have no choice but to remove myself, to jump off the call, to hang up, right? And then if they continue, then you do it. Sometimes boundary violations do end in no contact or formal separations in some way. Sometimes they end in limited time together. Sometimes they're just for the moment, and other times they're ongoing. So you're thinking of what contributes to flourishing, health, and safety when you're upholding them, right? I personally had to like hang up on a family member because they continued to give me unsolicited advice when I asked them to stop several times. They could not manage their nervous system at all. They couldn't do it. And I'm like, all right, bye. Um, it's important to just know that boundaries aren't rejections. They're intentional choices that we make to remain in healthy relationship with one another. And I personally think it's just much easier to like cut someone off. Like that's like easy for me. It's easier to me for me than boundaries to be like deuces, like don't care, bye. Like, but of course that's going to be harder at work, but you can still give someone the cold shoulder or treat them badly. There are other ways, even if you're with someone all the time, to cut them off. um and I think it's easier than setting a boundary, but I think boundaries are lead to more freedom. So we also have to realize when we've overstepped an internal boundary that we have and have betrayed ourselves. So when that happens, it's important for us to redevelop a relationship to our own sense of self-trust. Sometimes where we someone maybe tries to violate our boundaries, or we We do things that are in violation of them, and it's important for us to redevelop trust with ourselves. And I think it's really important for us to have a self and community care plan when there's a violation of boundaries. Like, how will you take care of yourself, and how will the community take care of the community when there is a violation? Now, it's important to just really be clear that boundaries are not demands, they're not ultimatums, they're not manipulations, and they're not punishments. They're limits that we set for personal and collective flourishing. Ultimatum at its origin means the last word, which means I get to say and do what I want, and you have to comply, or there's a punishment. Ultimatums are power plays, and sometimes we do use them when we have power so we can keep the upper hand, or people who are really unsafe or traumatized may use an ultimatum to try to gain the upper hand. And so it's important when we're thinking about boundaries that we have these distinctions. Demands are similar. There's an implication here that we have a right to something that the person must give us, or there will be consequences. If they don't change, if they don't do X, Y, and Z, then I'm gonna, they're cut off, they're punished. And if we're in punishment mode, we actually just need to be honest about that. We need to be honest that we just want to punish people. But we also need to understand that that's not what a boundary is. A boundary isn't making someone pay. And making someone pay is not the same as creating peace. So when we're exploring boundaries at the organizational level, it's important for us to consider who to involve. How do I involve people in the creations of these boundaries, and to consider whether they will be informal, formal, or technical. So there's different ways of things in the world, right? Informal is when we just kind of like know what to do or not to do because we learn from seeing others, or there's maybe been like a minor punishment or a shaming. Using the example of like emailing after 5, you may have gotten a snide comment about someone if you emailed after 5 once. And so you kind of learn, oh, I'm not really supposed to do that. You may have watched someone else get punished, and so you learn to not do it. Formal things are things that are in writing. So you show up to a job and you get a manual that says, we have a boundary, a guideline that says that we don't email past 5 p.m. No emails only between 8 and 5, or 9 and 5, whatever your hours are. Now, technical boundaries would be things that involve technical details about how to do it. What do we do? This is like the step-by-step of it all. This is like the nitty-gritty of it. So technical might be, so you might have like a formal, email between 8 and 5, but the technical is like, we ask you to log off from all work functions at 5 p.m. unless there is a specific special event that you're going to be at. So this is like the how. So I'm not just telling you like what to do. I'm not just suggesting it, but this is like, no, this is what you're expected to do. This is how you do it. This is how you live it. And so those are important things to really consider when you're thinking about doing boundaries within the organization. Boundaries will always be focused on the flourishing of the organization and of the individuals within the organization. So before we go into Q&A, I want to talk about space one last time, just because it shapes so much of us, of how we move through the world, how we understand the world. So boundaries, right? They are what we set so we can remain in relationship with people. They are not fortresses that we put up to keep people out. So boundaries are flexible and conditional. So we can put up solid walls around ourselves with no windows, no doors, no way in. That is a fortress. In the conversation about space, that is what is called a fixed feature of a space. A solid wall, immovable, just can't get through it. There's another option to have a dynamic space feature, which is really what a boundary is, right? We can put up walls with doors and windows. We can give people keys to our doors so some people have access to what other people might have to knock before entering. Maybe there's a price for admission. We can decide whether the windows have screens or they're double pane. These are boundaries. These are dynamic things that shift based on people, circumstances, and contexts. So we want to think about that. And this also, within the organization that you're in, like you might have some, fixed spaces like offices. You might have some semi-fixed spaces like cubicles, and that can be moved around, torn down, that kind of thing. And you might have some dynamic spaces like a boardroom or a meeting room, which is very much the setup of that is going to be based upon who's there and who's not, and what's needed in the space at the time. So we really want to remember that boundaries are dynamic, right? A boundary that I might need because I have unresolved work trauma might not be necessary when I actually have the support from the boundary to work through it. So if I have unresolved work trauma and I'm constantly being triggered at work, I'm not going to actually be able to work through the trauma. So when I set a boundary around that, it gives me actually space to be able to work through what that trigger is. So then as I'm continuing to work through it, then maybe my boundary can shift and change, right? And so we just want to remember, not walls, not fixed, dynamic, and knowing that we can change and people can change. Things can change as we go through seasons, um, as we do our healing work, as people come and go, right? And other people may come to us with walls, just walls, because some people might feel like they cannot ever be unprotected. They feel like they have to protect themselves. So they walk around with a fortress because safety eludes them. And breaking through their walls would be like a wrecking ball or a sledgehammer or something violent, right? And that's not what we want. We want to be able to honor people. We want to be able to be people who are self-aware, self-reflective, and attuned. We want to be people who are committed to setting the stage and space for safety to arise and be present, right? Who choose gentleness, respect, care, and honor, maybe even love. So, our boundaries, again, there are these beautiful, healthy limits that help us be able to say to one another, this is how we get healthy and stay healthy. This is what leads to flourishing. And how can we be mutually responsible for one another's safety, health, and flourishing? So, one thing before we go to Q&A that I think is really, really important is that we remember that people are allowed to feel sad and they are allowed to feel disappointed when a boundary is set. Same with you. You're actually allowed to have your feelings. I was talking to one of my clients about something similar, and they were talking about their mom and this boundary that they have with their mom. And I'm like, yeah, she might actually be just really disappointed. She's allowed to be disappointed. That doesn't mean that it's the wrong decision. Someone having a feeling doesn't mean it's the wrong decision. We are human. We are made to have feelings. We are made to be sad when things change. And even good change, even healthy change, often requires grief. But in our culture, we're not taught to honor that grief. We're not taught to process through it. We're taught to move on. The time heals. And that is not really true. It's not really true.